Hey, we're getting up to critical mass here. I'm gonna go and say, why don't we get
All
started?
right.
I'll ease into it and
Excellent.
catch people up if they're behind. So again, thank you folks for signing up for this presentation. We've got the title here, Organs Choice Grow Modestly or Not at All. The purpose today is really to sort of set the stage for this year's Oregon Leadership Summit, which is scheduled for December 8th at the Oregon Convention Center. And we just simply at this point want to put out some information so that when we get together, at least many of us are on the same page with respect to where Oregon's economy stands and where it's headed. So here's my hypothesis. For decades, growth seemed inevitable in Oregon. Railroads, highways, and fiber lines stitched the state into the national economy. And after that happened, its forests, coastlines, and mountains drew talent from across the country. And for two generations, the last two generations, the central question was how to manage that growth, how to avoid California sprawl. But I'm going to try to make the case that that era has ended because today, Oregon finds itself in a changing nation. We're older, we're less mobile, we have falling birth rates, and certainly for the time being, immigration has stalled. The drivers of automatic expansion have slowed. Economic growth is no longer guaranteed, and it doesn't happen without effort. So now the choice facing Oregon is stark. Pursue modest, deliberate economic growth or accept the costs of standing still. In today's slow-growing U.S., unmanaged rapid growth is no longer our threat. Stagnation is. Sustained prosperity depends on a stable workforce, which requires modest population growth, not for its own sake, but to support jobs, public services, and community well-being. So that's going to be the end of my reading slides. We're going to get into data now, and I'm going to try to persuade you that that sort of opening set of hypotheses is true. So here's the first piece of data. This is U.S. population growth going back to the country's founding by decade. And so you can see, not surprisingly, in those very early decades of the United States, we're growing by more than 30% a decade per year. And then it started to tail off. And William Fry at Brookings noted that in the 2010s, the country grew by 6.6%. That was the lowest rate of growth in the country's history. Part of that has to do with much declined fertility rates. So here's the history going back to 1960. Women on average were having more than 3.5 children each. That declined sharply in the 1960s to under two and is now approaching only 1.5. I don't have the chart here for Oregon, but I'm going to say that you go look up that data, the fertility rates are lower in Oregon than they are in the nation. And then if there is a chart that I would say there are a couple here that I think deserve to be on the cover of this presentation. This is one of them. So this is the Congressional Budget Office's forecast for U.S. population going forward. We've got some history in there as well. And it's got sort of three lines to it. So if you look at this dark blue line, that is the so-called natural rate or change in population, the number of births in this country minus the number of deaths. And what you can see is that's steadily coming down from a decent rate of growth as recently as 2005. But CBO is projecting that in the early 2030s, that's going to turn negative. And of course, that has both to do with the aging of the baby boomer population and that low fertility rate that I just referenced. So that goes negative. That means that for the foreseeable future in this country, our population grows only if we have immigration. And so you can see the history there in immigration. We did have a big surge that was well documented during the Biden administration. That has come down sharply. And CBO's projection is that in percentage terms, that's going to stick around at around 0.3% a year. If they're right about that projection, you can see that what we did is we just came off the slowest growth decade in US history, and we're going to gradually trend to zero over the next quarter century. So now, sort of pivoting to Oregon, what does this look like if we look at Oregon's history? So these are the same sort of decade percentage growth statistics going back to our founding as a state. So if you look at the very beginning, that's 1870. That's the population growth that you would have seen in the 1860s that just preceded it. And again, you can see this very strong growth at the very beginning. There weren't many people here to start with, and the wagon trains and the like brought folks in. And then you start to you get into some historical points. If you look at the 1910 bar that's over 60%, that's the decade, the 1900s that preceded it was the decade that railroads punched their way into the state and the timber economy took off. If you look at 1950, that's capturing the growth in the 1940s. That's a 40% increase in one decade. A lot of that had to do with World War II shipbuilding, and we had a massive defense industry buildup in Portland, in present day Swan Island. And then you can get to 1980, that's capturing the growth of the 1970s. The state in a single decade grew by 26%. That's when Tom McCall famously requested that people visit but don't stay here. 2000's another good run with an awful lot of growth in Washington County in particular and the Portland metro area. But then you can see as we go forward, 2010 and 2020 are actual outcomes. 2030 through 2050 are projections that we are settling into probably an era of 0.5% a year or maybe 5% per decade growth. It is unlikely, given what's going on in the United States, that we're going to repeat this 20% growth in a decade in the future. Here's Oregon births and deaths going back to 1980. This is something I'd give Josh Lerner, former deputy state economist, a lot of credit for anticipating and trying to make sure that policymakers were aware of. He was talking about this 10, 15 years ago. Their expectation, as I recall, back in 2015, is that the deaths would cross over births this year, sort of 2025, but you can see that sharp increase in 2020 associated with COVID accelerated that timetable, and that projection of deaths minus births will continue as far as the state forecast goes. The takeaway on this is that the state now is in a period of natural population decline, that among those who are here, we are expecting for the foreseeable future more deaths than births. And so the only way the state grows is with net domestic and international migration into the state, more people moving in than people moving out. So to put it differently, if Tom McCall's request of visit but don't stay came true, this state would be in a state of gradual population decline. Here's a couple of alternative looks at what we thought 2028 would look like. So we have a forecast that the state issued in December of 2019. At that point, we thought there would be about 4.7 million Oregonians in 2028. Then, if you look at the May 2025 forecast, the one that sort of established the amount of money for the state budget that we're currently in, we're down to 4.4 million residents for 2028. That's a loss of 300,000. I think there have been times in the past where Joe Courtwright would say that every person that comes into this state is sort of the equivalent of a lottery ticket. You don't know who's going to be the one who's going to create the next big exciting company or economic activity, and we are missing those opportunities as that population declines or slows down as much as it has. So now I'm going to pivot to sort of an argument briefly here as to why Oregon needs moderate or deliberate growth. I think there are, there are a fair number of Oregonians who, when you ask them and you show them data like I just did, are sort of relieved. They would prefer uh, no growth or even potentially some population decline. They don't like having to drive out 84 and get a permit in advance to park at Multnomah Falls. And they certainly don't like some of the traffic that gets snarled up in the Portland area or other parts of the state. And so we can't simply say, hey, growth is good, take our word for it. I think we have to make a case for that. So why might we want growth? Here's an illustration that comes out of Michigan. Governor Whitmer recognized Michigan's challenges uh, several years ago and sort of advanced. She convened a growth council, put some economists and a whole host of other Michiganders in charge of it, and are making the case for some positive growth in that state. And so you get this virtuous cycle that you see on the left. You get hopefully some natural growth. You get some positive net migration into the state that creates a vibrant economy that builds your tax revenue, allows for public investment, uh, fosters community well-being if that public investment is well spent, and it creates this nice cycle. The path that Michigan, or the loop that Michigan is in now, is slowing birth rates, negative net migration. You end up with labor market challenges, revenue stagnation, declining community well-being, and this sort of self-reinforcing cycle of slow growth. I would say that right now, where I'm sitting in Multnomah County, we are beginning to feel that a little bit. This county in particular has had slow growth coming out of the pandemic, both population and job growth. And you can see the strain on public budgets. When you're not growing, your property tax base isn't growing much either. Certainly, we've had challenge with the values of downtown commercial office buildings. That's been a headwind. But in addition, you just haven't had many new housing or multifamily housing developments built. You haven't had as much remodeling going on in housing. And so that property tax revenue, which is limited at 3%, we used to count on maybe another percentage point or more out of growth to get that property tax growth up to 4% plus a year. That hasn't been coming, and consequently, you see those deficits start to build in the city and the county's general funds, and we have a harder and harder time paying for essential services, the police, the fire, the parks, the prosecutors, the jails, et cetera. So in terms of trying to make this case, one argument is that growth, some modest growth, positive growth, brings good jobs, construction jobs, healthcare employment, education keeps enrollments stable so that you're not constantly in school closure debates, et cetera. And it's good jobs in the places that we have typically had the hardest time growing those jobs, those middle income jobs. We've had an awful lot of success growing at the low end and the very high end of the workforce, but growth both in population and in jobs brings nice reinforcement into the middle. Another argument for growth is that the bills don't shrink if we're not growing or shrinking. So we've got, a 24 plus billion-dollar liability in our pension program, PERS. That doesn't shrink if our population is flat or declining. So we sort of have to ask ourselves, do we want to pay for that legacy obligation on our own with the people that we have here now? Or would we like to invite some more people to help carry that load over the course of the next couple of decades as we buy that down? I would say we also have that same question with respect to infrastructure projects across the state. The replacement of the interstate bridge and Oregon's contribution to it is going to be paid for either by all of us who are here now or a slightly larger population. Same for the Burnside Bridge replacement and other infrastructure across the state of Oregon. And then finally, I would say we've got a care crisis coming. We have a senior population that is growing twice as fast as the working age population. And elder care and child care, which is already in crisis, are competing for the same scarce workforce. All you have to go to is places like Maine or Japan to sort of see what an elder care crisis and adjacent child care crisis looks like. It's a very, very tough spot in the caregiving workforce, and slow or very no growth or declining growth would exacerbate those crises. Certainly not the only three arguments for growth. In it also, I would add innovation, getting back to Courtwright's example that everybody coming into the state is a lottery ticket. So now I'm going to pivot and I'm going to talk about 5 pressures that are driving Oregon towards stagnation. So you saw the forecasts that I talked about that are basically anchored on about a 0.5% a year growth in population. That in that last year sort of gets you in the 5% a decade or so population growth. I think that could potentially be optimistic. That might be what we are aiming for. But I would say there are 5 pressures out there in Oregon right now that, left unaddressed, would start to push us closer to zero or into negative territory. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause for just a minute or so, and I would like you in the chat, in a single word, to add what you might think might be a pressure out there that could potentially drive Oregon towards stagnation. What is a headwind that is making us less attractive to people or businesses moving here? So I'll just pause here and let that chat fill up for a little bit, and then I will reveal the 5 that I think, but would love to know what's on people's minds. Kayla, do you see any chats coming in on this one?
I'm seeing a lot of housing, a lot of taxes and regulations. Housing, taxes, housing, taxes. Let's see. Education is coming in as a theme, specifically K-12.
Okay.
Regulations are too high. Homelessness as part of housing.
Okay.
Childcare and the cost of it.
Okay. All right. All right. I'm going to go ahead and reveal my 5, but we are going to save all of this. And, this is as much about having a conversation and getting feedback on what people think about this presentation. So it sounds like we might agree with some of the comments in the chat. So here are the 5 that I would say are threatening our ability to grow at all. And the first one, not surprising at all, high housing prices and the resulting homeless crisis I would put together, and we can talk through that. Each of these I've got some slides to defend. K-12 schools among the lowest performing in the United States, fires and smoke, an over-reliance on the individual income tax, especially in Portland. And then the fifth one, a deeply rooted cultural ambivalence about growth and an aligned policy environment to go with it. So those are my five. Let me sort of step through and try to make my case for those. So first of all, the high housing, no news here. The housing market, we're one of 10 states in the country where home prices have risen by more than 600% since 1984. It is certainly a phenomenon along the west coast of the United States and into the Intermountain West. And then you've got Maine out there joining us in that dubious distinction. Here's a chart that sort of, this goes back to 1990, Oregon House Price Index cracking 600% since 1990, and Oregon's median household income growing by about half that amount. Obviously, no alert the media here. This is really the piece that I believe coming out of the Great Recession, in particular, with a big dip in production, accelerated this problem. So here's private housing units approved by permit in Oregon going back to 1988. Excuse me. You see sort of a peak right in the middle part of the aughts that got us over 30,000 units per year in production. Great Recession slowed that down a lot. But you can see that we grew out of that in the 2010s at a very slow rate. We were still growing in terms of households and way underproduced relative to our needs. Folks at Echo Northwest and Up for Growth and the like have put a fine point on the legacy underproduction and the need there. You can see a lot of good public policy in Oregon. The governor and former Speaker Kotek really started a call to action as early as 2015 and have made a host of nation-leading reforms in housing, sort of much more allowance of multifamily housing in areas zoned for single family across the state in large munis, and then also sort of newly minted housing production strategies and accountability at the state level. That has, as you can see, yet to produce outcomes. You've got a challenge right now in that the macro economy with high interest rates and high construction costs are making it difficult to build just about anywhere in the United States. But at some point, when those headwinds let up a little bit, Oregon has got to move closer to that 30,000 plus if we're gonna make progress on those prices. And I would say that this crisis, which is foremost in Oregonians' mind, the homelessness crisis, is related to that. If I go into a public forum and ask people, is homelessness principally caused by high housing costs in the housing market, or is it principally caused by the personal challenges of individuals who are homeless? You probably get half of the room raising their hand for each of those conditions. What I would say is that it is the collision of those two. People with deep personal challenges who live in expensive housing markets, that's where you see the incidence of homelessness being the highest. And where you see that in the United States is up and down the west coast of the United States and in the DC to Boston corridor on the East Coast. You do not see as high incidence of homelessness in places like Arkansas and West Virginia, which certainly have their challenges with disability, behavioral health, and substance abuse addiction. So that was pressure number one. Pressure number two would be our underperforming by standard measures of standardized testing in reading and in math um, in the nation. Here's some findings from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. These are tests that are administered across the United States. They go into each state every other year and sort of randomly select schools that together sort of mimic the overall statewide demography and administer these tests in math and in reading in fourth and eighth grade. And I'm just going to show you the fourth grade results here. Urban Institute, you've got unadjusted scores in blue. That's just, these are scale scores. And then you have adjusted scores where the Urban Institute has gone in and said, well, if you've got a tougher demography to serve, more poverty, et cetera, we're going to bump your score up to account for that, because it was never all that fair to try to compare a place like Mississippi to a Massachusetts, which has a very different demography that it's serving. When you make those adjustments, you can see Mississippi, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and then Massachusetts end up as the top performers on fourth grade math. If you look at the lowest performing states, Oregon is the lowest performing when you take that demography into account. Come over to the reading on the right-hand side here, you get basically the same answers. Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Massachusetts at the highest, Oregon at the lowest. If you don't like the demographic adjustment, throw it out. That's okay. Take a look at where Oregon stands with its blue dot and compare it to Mississippi's. In both cases, Oregon students on fourth grade math and reading are underperforming Mississippi's head to head. And I've spent an awful lot of time in my career working with the Chalkboard Project, with the Gates Foundation, with the Oregon Business Council on education matters. As recently as a decade ago, Oregon was firmly in the middle of the distribution on these kinds of outcomes, and have fallen sort of dramatically over the course of the last decade to the bottom. Some of that, obviously, along with other states, was pandemic related, but these declines started before that. They started in the middle part of the last decade, and I would attribute them to, in part, the end of a federal accountability system, No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top under Obama, that was sort of lifted circa 2016, and nothing in this state took its place in terms of holding. We give an awful lot of local control to school districts, 197 of them, but there has been very little in the way of a higher state level accountability placed in that system. And plenty of debate here as to why our test scores have declined as much, but I think that is one place we're going to have to look. Legislature and the governor passed an accountability bill that, like housing, is going to have to start to show some results. Here's high school graduation. We have always been sort of near the tail end of that. This is for 2022 school year. There's obviously apples and oranges here, different standards across states, but in going back and forth with federal officials years ago, they said, sure, but you can't hide behind that. Oregon shouldn't be where it is in this list. I would say related to this, with many of the same features of low high school graduation, is Oregon's above average chronic absenteeism. The share of kids who miss more than 10% of the school year, or roughly 17, 18 days a year. Oregon has always had elevated rates of chronic absenteeism. And those were exacerbated by the pandemic, and we're in a top tier there as well. So addressing both that achievement, as you saw in those test scores, and attainment, sort of showing up and finishing, is going to be critical to the state. All of that took place during a period, those performance declines during a period where the legislature made some pretty significant investments in K-12 schools. These are inflation adjusted spending per student on operations dating back to 1987, Oregon and the nation. And so you can see in the 90s, we were a little bit above the US average. And then, beginning in 2000, we had the tech recession. Oregon didn't have reserves or much of a rainy day fund as we went into that recession. And we really just had a terrible decade there. So you can see the investments in the US continue to climb. We bounce around in inflation adjusted terms for roughly 13 years at roughly $13,000 per kid in today's dollars. Really hit a low watermark circa 2013. We were probably ranked 37th or 38th in the country in spending per student. But then the legislature, the economy, and ultimately the Student Success Act in 2019, we sort of gradually sort of pulled our way back and are close now to being back to the US average in terms of spending per student. So essentially what we have done in the last decade is figure out a way to get spending back up to a national norm, but we've seen outcomes sort of move in the exact opposite direction. Now, the third of the pressures, smoke and fire. If you had asked me this about this issue even 12 to 18 months ago, I would have referenced Cliff Mass. He's a University of Washington atmospheric scientist. And he put out sort of almost like a cartoon map 15 or 20 years ago that showed how he thought climate change was going to play out across the United States. And he had a bunch of drawings that sort of showed, severe storms and flooding in the Southeast, sea level rise in Florida and New York, drought in California and excessive heat in Arizona, all of that. And then he showed this little carve out of the Pacific Northwest that was largely untouched. At least on his map, it sort of looked like this was going to be the haven, and we were going to get away with without nearly as much impact. Even the rocky coasts were going to protect us from sea level rise in much of the state. And so I would think, and had always thought that maybe this was going to be our sort of reinforced natural amenity comparative advantage. That more and more people would want to be here because so much of the rest of the country was going to be struggling with the effects of climate change. These folks at the First Street Foundation, that's an analytic think tank based out of Indianapolis, have changed my mind. And so they have put out a series of national risk assessments. I've got a couple of charts from a couple of them that put a fine point on where they think the climate risks are. And what you see here is a map of their sort of county by county assessment of how many different kinds of climate risk different places across the country are facing. Here you can see a lot going on in California and reaching up into Southwest Oregon, where you get air, flood, fire, heat, and drought potential in those counties. All of Oregon is exposed to one or more of these features, but Southwest Oregon in particular, and then I would say up through Central Oregon and the Columbia Gorge, I think are those that are going to be challenged among the most. These folks at First Street have collaborated with Zillow. And so if you go on Zillow now and look at home listings for any house that's for sale in the United States, you can scroll down in that listing to You can look at the walk score, you can look at the transit score, you can look at the school ratings, and then you can finally get down to a climate rating. And so these are just some screenshots I took from when I did this back in January earlier this year. Uh, the first one on the left is a house in my neighborhood that was for sale. And it's saying that, in relative sense, air conditions in my neighborhood are going to be among the worst in the country. This year, they were projecting 19 days of unhealthy air. 30 years from now, not too much change, 21 days of unhealthy air. So obviously a challenge there. Then we get this home that was in Deschutes River Woods, which is kind of a ruralish community, a little bit south of downtown. And there you can see some concerns about fire danger there. 6 out of 10, a major concern. And they were saying that within the next 30 years that this house for sale, there was a 12% chance that that house would be in a wildfire. And then I came across a house, and this this house was for sale down outside of Ashland. And they were saying that in the next 15 years, 21% chance that that was going to be involved in a wildfire. In the next 30 years, 41% chance that house would be in a wildfire. So, we have been through a period when the legislature was debating a controversial wildfire map. I don't really know if that matters anymore, what the legislature's opinion about the wildfire map is. These data are out there. The insurance industry is going to demand them. The banking industry is going to demand them, and they are going to be produced. This will get updated continuously, and these numbers may swing in important ways in one direction or another, but those data are going to be out there, and they're going to be out there at the property level. So this was the takeaway from First Street Foundation in one of their more recent national risk assessments on property prices. They said by 2055, the combined impact of wildfires and their smoke will drive significant migration across the United States. Wildfire smoke will likely cause 12.8 million Americans to relocate, primarily in Western states, including California, Washington, and Oregon. Now, I don't have all their detailed migration analyses, but suffice it to say that my old hypothesis that Cliff Mass, that this was going to be clear sailing and we are going to have a comparative advantage in our traditional historical advantage on natural amenities were going to be amplified by climate change. I think they're at this point proving that wrong. So that's fires and smoke. Now we get to this issue of income taxes, and especially here in Portland. A lot of debate about this topic now, but we've always had high income taxes, 9.9 at the state level, adjacent to a state that has had no income taxes. We have in 2020, voters passed two local income taxes, which are relatively rare in urban public finance. 1% at the top margin to fund targeted homeless services, and 3% at the top margin to fund preschool for all. That placed us in second position nationally on top marginal tax rates, second only to New York City. That 14.8 that they have kicks in only for households up at $25 million or more. Take that one away, and we're sort of dead even with New York City for the top place. The big debate here, and it is an ongoing debate, is whether or not this has harmed Portland's economy and, frankly, Oregon's economy. And certainly the theory is relatively clear. Ed Glazer would say that an essential feature of cities is that people in capital can readily leave them. And that mobility is a key feature of urban as opposed to national and public finance. His argument is that if a small area like a city or a county changes taxes or services abruptly relative to their neighbors, that it is easier for income and capital to reorganize itself to other places that it would prefer to be. That's harder to do at a national level. And that's in part why the federal government has been the place that has done most of the nation's sort of redistributive public policy. So this one we'll put in as candidate number 4 of challenges. Now, the last one, sort of the deep ambivalence about growth in Oregon among our population and an aligned policy environment to go with it. Here I have sort of a picture of a battery cell factory that is under construction in the state of Mississippi. It's going to employ 2,000 people in it. The hope among folks at Daimler here in Oregon was that this battery cell factory could be sited in Oregon, but we really just don't have much industrial, shovel-ready industrial land ready to accommodate it. And so folks look elsewhere. That's just one point. So let's step through this one. First, in terms of Oregonians' perspectives on growth, this thanks to our good friends at Oregon Values and Beliefs Center from 2023. When you ask folks what do they think about growth, 16% think it's a good thing. Half of the population think it's both a good and a bad thing. So you are entering this conversation with Oregonians, elected officials, when they're knocking on doors. This is what they're hearing. So if you think about sort of policy agendas or policy environments that might even be pro-modest growth, you're going to get some skepticism when you walk up to the doors. In terms of what folks are concerned about, again, from OVBC, a higher population means more traffic, congestion, and strains on public services. You get, the high 80s percent agreeing with that. Increased numbers put more stress on natural resources. Increased numbers mean more crowded outdoor destinations. In-migration means more competition for jobs and housing. So a lot of legitimate concerns here that have to be addressed before you can begin to have a conversation with Oregonians, even about modest, deliberate growth. And then you do get down to these smaller folks saying growing population means more business, good jobs, and prosperity. And we need a growing population of workers to contribute to Social Security and the tax base. Those obviously smaller ranks supporting those. But this kind of posture and this kind of understanding in the state is going to have to be addressed before much can be done on the policy front. So what aligned sort of policy environment has this ambivalence about growth fed? First, it does show up in our use of land. This is a study out of U.S. Department of Agriculture that looks at the share of land across all U.S. states that is in urban use. You can see that in no small part because of our very intentional land use policies, Senate Bill 100 back in the 1970s. Oregon is sort of at the tail of the distribution with 1.2% of its land in urban uses. That compares to 3.3% as a U.S. average, and up the street in Washington, 3.8%. The point here is, first of all, to applaud the work of the 1970s. Clearly, in the 1970s, there was a threat of California sprawl. The state did grow a quarter in a single decade, and then a couple decades later grew by another 20%. So that machinery to slow and tame growth was well timed. And for that, we can be happy that the entire drive from Portland to Salem is not a strip mall. But here we are looking out 25 years into the future. Does that machinery completely left unchanged serve us well as we look 25 years into the future? On the regulatory side, we've got high regulations. I think some people talked about that in the chat. This is work out of George Mason University, where they count out through AI and machine learning the number of sort of mandates by sector, professional services, utilities, food manufacturing, et cetera. The number is how many regulations are sitting in there for Oregon versus the US median. And you can see in every one of those lines that we have more than the US median. The idea here is to sort of step through and think about, as those have been added, is there anything that needs to be adjusted and scaled back? Regulatory streamlining is not sexy work, but is probably necessary work as we try to think about how to grow this state. If you ask Oregon, or ask about Oregon's business environment, those sort of land use and regulatory processes show up. Ask economic development professionals, city managers, and mayors. Do they think this is a good place to do business, a desirable place for business, a supportive business climate, or is the tax system supportive of business? You can see the share that agree there. 33% saying a desirable place for business, a quarter a supportive business climate, and 14% saying a tax system that's supportive of business. These are not the perspectives of business leaders. These are civic leaders, elected officials, and economic development professionals who have that perspective. So those are the five. I'm going to try to end on a bit of a high note here. At least we are not sort of stuck in a humid Midwest trying to work our way out of these challenges. We do have a choice. Oregon's strengths, despite these pressures that I've just talked about, we have natural beauty that draws talent. I would say that Oregon is in the top decile, even maybe the top 5% of most beautiful pieces of real estate on the globe. That has been our comparative advantage since our founding and before our founding, and it continues to be. We do have urban growth capacity that you could add without sprawling. So there is space to loosen the belt a little without completely undoing the spirit of Senate Bill 100. We have an innovation legacy that builds on what's next, starting with the shipyards and the Kaiser shipyards during World War II. That was probably the biggest productivity demonstration in US history, to Intel's execution of Moore Law in Hillsborough, to our invention of jogging and an entire industry to go with it. We are innovators, and that's our secret sauce. And we do have clean energy resources to power a low carbon economy. That's going to require some land use amendments so that we have the ability to transmit energy and to site green energy windmills and solar and the like. So we have strengths and we can build on them. That's the positive news. So I'm going to wrap up with the choice here. Many of Oregon's systems, our schools, our regulations, our land use rules, and permitting processes were built for a different time to solve yesterday's problems. But the future has never looked less like the past than it does right now. If we fail to adapt, we risk locking ourselves into a future of stagnation, scarcity, and decline. Yet this is still a choice. We can choose to modernize, to grow deliberately, and to build a state that remains vibrant, inclusive, and full of possibility. The question is no longer whether we can afford to change, but whether we can afford not to. So I'm going to pause there. And Kayla, I've got, looks like 9 minutes or so to maybe take. If you see a couple of questions that appear to be repeating themselves, I'd be happy to field those. And then I'll have a request here at the end.
Excellent. I sent you the first question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let me go if I can find that.
Or I can ask you.
Why don't you just ask me?
Question 1 from Michael Anderson. Do you think the aging of the population might lead to shifts in the demand for where people would live? More need in places with better medical and other support services, for example, or places where it's less important to be able to drive a lot in the dark?
Well, rapidly becoming one of those aging people, I will definitely look forward to being in a place where I don't have to drive in the dark. Uh, but I would say, Michael, we should absolutely think about being truly an age-friendly state. That has been a strong suit in places, and what sort of first and foremost comes to mind is the provision of healthcare. And so how do we turn as many of our places in Oregon as locations where people can trust a local healthcare system and can comfortably age in place? I think that's going to be a central question, because there's an awful lot of appealing places, smaller towns in this across the state that are easier to navigate by cars, but have marginal healthcare systems that people don't and probably shouldn't trust as much as they would like to.
Well said. Question 2 from Anonymous. Many other states like Texas and Florida make it easier to do business, less taxes and regulations, thereby bringing in jobs and population growth. Is Oregon looking at these trends of mass population growth for states like these and possibly taking some lessons from the success of those states?
Well, I think there's certainly, I would say there's lessons from every state. We have to be true to our culture. If you look at Texas, I grew up in what they called a disposable suburb. Arlington, Texas, in the early 1970s was sort of it was one of the most rapid growing uh, suburbs in the United States. They sort of filled it up with housing, and then they move on. In the last decade, I think it was Frisco, Texas. They just keep going because they'll use more and more land. It isn't very beautiful land. They just keep growing and they build more cities. That's just not going to that's not going to work here. It's not aligned with our culture. So that sort of excessive uh, sort of expansive sprawl approach that they have in Texas. I was watching something on Frontline last night about where, Houston's built housing developments literally in reservoirs. And when Hurricane Harvey came in, lo and behold, the reservoir filled up. So I think there are parts of what Texas is doing. We do have to look at parts of things that are working well there, sort of the intentionality and how quickly they're moving through permitting. And I would guess that they have some lessons to learn in their schools because their kids are outperforming us. But there are also some cautionary tales that I think you'd find in other states as well.
Yeah, that's well said. There are a lot of questions centering around tax policy and specifically sales tax. Do you have any comments on how Oregon could approach a sales tax or if that could be an option?
Yeah. So I would say this is one where the technical answer is really easy and the political answer is really hard. So I think we've all known for as long as I've been alive, because I actually uh, made a pitch for sales taxes as a high school debater, that we don't have a three-legged stool. We limited our property taxes, which put pressure on services. So then we've raised income taxes a couple of different times. We have pushed that. That's what I would argue beyond the limit that we should have. We're starting to fill in a kind of a half of a third leg of the stool with gross receipts taxes, which from a technical perspective are probably the worst way to raise money. They are politically feasible, but from a technical perspective are one of the worst examples of tax policy. So yes, I think if somehow we could wave a wand and talk Oregonians into getting off of their opposition to sales taxes, that would be a step in the right direction, along with some reform to the property tax system, which at this point is so wildly inequitable across the state. At some point, that people are going to wake up and understand how their neighbors, just a few neighborhoods over or across the state, are paying substantially different rates for the same value of house. That's going to drive people nuts. So that's a matter of when, not if, that's gonna break.
Yeah.
How about we
Yeah.
do one more, and then I'll make a request and we'll sign off.
Excellent. Okay, one more from Anonymous. Going back to education performance, what do you think that these numbers indicate? For instance, if Oregon is at 199 and Michigan is at 218, how big of a difference is that really? What does it translate to in a way that means something in the real world?
Yeah, well, we'll have to follow up on that one. Those are scale scores. Another way that you can look at those NAEPs are the sort of the share of kids in each state that are meeting sort of national reading or math benchmarks. So it's a little easier to digest in that form. So as we sort of go out and have conversations of that, we'll have those sort of meet and exceed standards rates to go along with those scale scores, which are a little harder to digest. So thank you for your questions. We're going to keep all of these, and all of your feedback we're going to look at closely. Again, this is a conversation that is teeing us up for the Leadership Summit. So I have three requests coming out of this. First, keep the conversation going and share this deck with your networks if you found it useful. Obviously, if you didn't find it useful, don't share it with your networks. Kayla is going to drop the link, I think, to this presentation into the chat. And then I think even if you Google Oregon Business Plan, if you don't get it through the chat, you can go find it and download it there as well. Again, we would welcome your feedback on the problem statement, and would love to have ideas for policy solutions here. This was clearly very heavy on problem statement and very light on policy solutions, but we hope to have a robust conversation of that at the Leadership Summit, which, again, to remind you, is December 8th at the Oregon Convention Center. So with that, I'm going to say, first of all, thank you so much to Kayla, who's been my partner in pulling this together. I couldn't have done it without you. And thank you to everybody out there who signed in, and look forward to keeping this conversation going.
Thank you for an amazing presentation, John.
All right, take care.
Thank you all.